"Who gave you permission to touch my office?" That was the first thing Damien Vale said when he opened the door and found a freezing little girl sitting in the chair no one in Boston was allowed to touch. Not a thief, not a killer. Just a child with wet sneakers, shaking hands, and eyes that looked like they had already seen too much loss. Maybe you know that feeling too well when life corners you so hard that fear stops mattering and love is the only thing left. This story is different because it is not just about power crime or betrayal. It is about what happens when the coldest man in the city meets a love fierce enough to walk through hell for family. Stay with me until the end then, like this video and comment where you are watching from. And maybe that was why Damien Vale did not order Ronan to drag the girl out by her wrists. Any other morning in any other room, one wrong move would have been enough. Men twice her size had made smaller mistakes and vanished into the dark machinery beneath his tower. But this child was not looking at him like a thief caught in the act. She was looking at him like someone standing in the last doorway left in the world. The office was silent except for the low hum of servers hidden behind steel walls and the faint hiss of snow against the glass. Boston still slept below them, sealed under winter. Inside the room, the heat should have been enough, yet the girl was shivering so hard the sleeves of her coat trembled against her wrists. Her laptop looked ancient. The corners scarred, one hinge repaired with tape, but the code racing across Damien's monitor was clean and merciless. Whoever she was, she knew exactly where to cut. Ronan kept his gun angled low, waiting for one word. Damien gave none. He walked forward instead, slow enough to let the girl understand something simple and terrible. The only reason she was still standing was because he had not decided otherwise. His gray eyes moved from the homemade bypass device on the desk to the damp footprints near the door, and then to the child herself. She was 13 at most. Light brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail that had partly fallen apart. Cheap canvas sneakers gone dark with slush. A coat too thin for a Boston winter night. Her face was pale from cold, but there was nothing weak in the way she held herself. Fear was there, yes. It lived in the tight line of her mouth and the quickness of her breath. It just did not have the final say. Damien stopped on the other side of the desk. "You said your sister would die," he said. "Start there." The girl swallowed hard, but her eyes did not drop. "My name is Ellie Bennett." The name meant nothing to him. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because lately too many important things had been happening in corners he had not bothered to look at. "I know who you are, Mr. Vale," she said. "I know what kind of place this is. I know if your security had found me downstairs, nobody would ask where I went." Ronan's jaw tightened at that. Damien did not move. Ellie drew one breath, then another, as if she had rehearsed this speech all night and was terrified the words would desert her now. "But my sister is running out of time. So if I had to choose between disappearing here and watching her die because I did nothing, I chose this." There was no drama in the way she said it. No trembling plea, just fact. Children who grow up too fast learn how to put pain on the table without decorating it. Damien looked at the old laptop wired into his system, then back at her. "How did you get into my building?" Ellie's lips parted. The answer came with a flat honesty that made Ronan glance at Damien. "I walked." "For how long?" "Almost 4 hours." Ronan frowned. "From where?" "South Boston." The room stayed still. Damien had spent most of his life around liars. Men lied to survive, to impress, to negotiate, to save face. Women lied to protect themselves from men like him. Politicians lied as a profession. He knew the tiny delays before a falsehood, the unnecessary details, the shift in the eyes. This girl had none of that. She was too cold, too tired, too far past performance. "You walked here in this weather," Damien said. Ellie nodded. "I left after 10. My grandmother and my sister were asleep." He said nothing. She kept going. "I didn't have train fare. I watched the cleaning crews for 3 nights first. One of them smokes outside the service entrance at 11:40. They prop the door for supplies. I came in behind the carts and hid in a maintenance closet near the loading dock until most of the floors went dark." Ronan lowered the gun a fraction more. Ellie pointed toward the bypass device with a small, stiff hand. "I built that from broken parts. The first layer on your office was not hard to study once I got into the internal network. The last layer was harder. The words were spoken almost apologetically, as if she knew she was discussing something impossible and did not want to sound proud of it. Damien's gaze sharpened. "You studied my system." Ellie looked at him for a second, then answered with the same calm. "I studied your money." That landed harder than defiance. She turned the screen toward him again. The spreadsheets were no longer lines and columns to Damien. They were beginning to look like blood under clean water. "Your advisor has been stealing from you through shell vendors," Ellie said. "Not fast enough to make noise, just steady enough to become normal." Her fingers flew over the keyboard. A list opened. Vendor names, payment schedules, invoice codes, authorizations. A company registered to a dead office address in Providence. A consulting firm with a tax identification number that belonged to a dissolved contractor in New Hampshire. A data service with quarterly payments so regular they looked safe until the layered approvals were peeled back. At the bottom of each chain sat the same signature. Victor Hale. For 15 years, Victor had stood at Damien's right hand in boardrooms, safe houses, private dinners, port negotiations, charity galas, and late-night cleanups. Victor knew where the legitimate books met the dirty ones. He knew what to say to bankers, what to say to attorneys, what to say to federal men who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. He had built the polished face of Damien's empire one transaction at a time, and now his name was suddenly everywhere. Damien rested one hand on the edge of the desk. "How do you know this?" Ellie hesitated, and for the first time the steel in her expression shifted. "My sister found it first." Something inside those 5 words changed the room. Damien watched her mouth tighten as she forced herself onward. "Her name is Claire Bennett. She worked at Hale Advisory for 3 years. She started as junior accounting staff and got promoted because she was better than people twice her age. She doesn't miss numbers. She doesn't miss anything." A flicker passed through Damien's mind. Hale Advisory was one of Victor's clean public fronts, respectable on paper, invisible at a glance, important only when money needed to move wearing a decent suit. Damien had never asked who sat in cubicles there. He paid people so he would not have to. Ellie kept speaking. 8 months ago, Claire noticed vendor payments that made no sense. She thought maybe it was bad bookkeeping at first. Then she started tracing them at night after everyone left. She cross-checked invoice dates, addresses, tax filings, reimbursement patterns. The more she looked, the worse it got. Her hand hovered over the keys. The screen shifted to a copied set of internal emails. She filed a report. Damien's eyes moved line by line. Subject: urgent review of vendor irregularities. A request for internal audit. Then another chain. Subject: personnel matter regarding Claire Bennett. Victor's name. Human resources. Direct language dressed in business phrases sharp enough to draw blood without staining the carpet. The first email was cold and efficient. She has accessed files outside her level. Contain this immediately. The second came 2 days later. A disciplinary file is prepared. Security will be present. The third was even shorter. The kind of short that meant the decision had already been made. Resolved. Ellie's voice dropped. They accused her of embezzlement with paperwork they planted under her login. Security walked her out before lunch. By the end of the week, nobody in finance would even answer her calls. Ronan had fully lowered the gun now. He slid it back under his coat. Damien did not blink. Outside, a plow scraped across the street below the sound, faint and metallic through the insulated glass. In the office, the heat was warm enough to loosen snow from Damien's shoulders. He barely felt it. What happened after she was fired? Ellie looked at the floor for the first time, only for a moment. She looked for work. Everywhere. Downtown firms, small offices, bookkeeping contracts, payroll work, remote auditing, nothing. Her record was ruined before she got to the interview stage. Ellie swallowed. And then they came to see her. Who? I don't know their names. 2 men. In a parking lot after one of her night delivery shifts. They told her if she talked, they knew which route I walked home from school. They knew my school, my bus stop, the grocery where my grandmother shops on Thursdays. Her voice did not rise. That made it worse. Damien knew exactly how threats like that worked. You did not need to hurt anyone when the imagination would do the work for you. Fear was most efficient when it stayed just one breath away from becoming real. She never told us, Ellie said. Not all of it. Not until I started noticing things. What things? Ellie looked up again. Her face had gone older somehow. She stopped sleeping. She started counting every dollar twice. She hid mail. She smiled too carefully. She told my grandmother not to walk to church alone. She walked me to school even when she came home from work at 3 in the morning. The words fell one after another, plain and devastating. My sister has been raising me since I was a baby. Our parents died in a car wreck when she was 14. My grandmother took us in, but Claire was the one who became everything. She learned how to warm bottles before she learned how to drive. She worked after school, then at night, then whenever anybody would pay her under the table. She used to cut her own winter gloves shorter at the fingers so she could count change faster. The office around them seemed absurd now. The leather, the oak, the silent machines, the city spread out beneath a ceiling of snow. Damien had built rooms like this so he would never again be touched by the kind of life she was describing. Ellie went on. She promised me I'd get to study computers for real one day, not just teach myself from junk and free sites and library books. She said I was going to have better than this. Her hand touched the old laptop gently, almost with embarrassment. She saved for it, little by little. Then everything went bad. Damien looked at the machine again and saw it differently now. Not scrap. Evidence of a promise. "And she's sick," Ellie said. Those 3 words entered the room like cold. Damien heard them, but something in him had already moved backward through time. A hospital corridor painted the wrong shade of green. The smell of bleach and old coffee. His mother lying under a blanket so thin it might as well have been apology. He had been 14, standing at the foot of a bed with wet shoes and no one to ask for help from. He had not thought about that night in years. Or rather, he had thought about it every day and called it something else. Ellie's voice pulled him back. She started coughing 3 months ago. She said it was nothing. Then she got weaker. Then she stopped eating as much because she kept saying she wasn't hungry. Last week I found the papers. Her fingers curled into her palm. She needs surgery. She hid the diagnosis in the bottom drawer under old bills because she thought I wouldn't look there. She thinks if she keeps acting normal, maybe we get 1 more month without being scared. She drew a breath that shook, but she is tired all the time now. Her hands shake when she pours tea. She has to sit down in the middle of doing dishes. Yesterday she smiled at me and I knew she was trying not to let me see the pain. I can tell when she lies about pain. No tears fell. Damien noticed that too. The child had gone beyond tears and come out somewhere much harder. And I knew Ellie said quietly if I waited for someone decent to fix it, she'd be dead before they got around to it. Ronan looked away toward the windows. Damien did not. The snow on the far harbor had turned the whole city to ash and pearl. Somewhere beneath that blank morning were train tracks, coffee shops opening office towers, warming up men in suits complaining about traffic, women hurrying children into boots, 1,000 ordinary lives. On the 38th floor of his tower, one exhausted girl in soaked shoes had just walked straight through the defenses of his world and placed the ugliest truth in it on his desk. He asked the only question that mattered now. "Where is your sister?" Ellie blinked as if she had not expected the question to come that quickly. "At home, I think, with my grandmother." "Think? I left after they fell asleep. Claire doesn't know I'm here." The corner of Damien's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. He imagined a sick young woman waking into dawn finding the apartment too quiet. The front door unlocked the little sister she had spent half her life protecting suddenly gone into a storm. He pulled his phone from his coat. Ronan watched him. Damien. That one word carried both caution and curiosity. You do not reroute the morning for strangers in their line of work. You do not walk into unknown apartments because a child tells you a sad story. You do not let yourself be maneuvered by desperation. Damien did not look at him. "Get the car ready." Ronan was silent for a beat. Then he nodded once and stepped toward the door, already speaking into his earpiece. Ellie seemed too cold and too stunned to move. Damien made his next call to Gideon Price. "I need everything on Victor Hale," he said. "Personal accounts, property titles, offshore exposure, educational trusts, any shell layered under family names," quietly. Gideon started to speak. Damien cut him off. 2 hours. He ended the call and dialed again. This time his voice changed by a degree almost too small to notice. "I need a surgical consult moved to the front of the line. Female 27 severe respiratory decline, likely urgent intervention. I'll send details in 10 minutes. He slid the phone away. Ellie was staring at him now, suspicious and uncertain. She did not thank him. Good, Damien thought. Gratitude too early would have made him trust her less. He walked to a closet inset into the office wall and took out a wool blanket meant for late nights that turned into longer ones. He held it out. Ellie hesitated, then took it. "Wrap it around you," he said. She did. Her small body disappeared inside it. When they stepped into the private elevator, Damien stood at one side, Ellie at the back, Ronan near the doors. Stainless steel walls reflected all three of them in stretched silver fragments. A crime boss with dried blood at the edge of one knuckle, a security chief who trusted no silence, a girl clutching a blanket around herself and an old laptop against her chest like both were equally necessary to stay alive. The elevator descended without sound. In the lobby, the world brightened into gray morning. The black sedan waited at the curb with heat spilling from the open door. Ellie paused before climbing in, almost as if warm leather and tinted windows belonged to a species of life she had only seen through glass. Damien got in across from her. For the first few minutes, none of them spoke. The city slid by in winter colors. Harbor fog, brick fronts, salt crust on the curbs, delivery trucks bundled pedestrians, a man sweeping snow from the steps of a corner deli. Downtown gave way street by street to older neighborhoods and lower roofs. A city can change class in 10 minutes if you know how to read its windows. Water dripped from Ellie's sneakers onto the floor mat in dark half-moons. Damien's eyes fell there, then to her socks, soaked through and clinging to her ankles. He bent without a word and switched on the heat vent near her feet to its highest setting. Ellie looked up fast, startled by the gesture. Damien turned his face toward the window before her expression could become anything he would have to answer. A memory pressed against him all the same. Himself at 14, walking home from the county hospital in shoes split at the sole each step, taking in freezing rain. No car, no heater, no blanket, no one sitting across from him making calls that could move the world. The sedan moved through South Boston now. Narrower streets, old brick walk-ups, faded storefronts, a laundromat with one light still blinking, a church bell striking somewhere in the distance. Ellie finally spoke. "She's going to be scared when she sees you." Damien turned from the window. "She worked for Victor," Ellie said. "She knows what your name means." He said nothing. Ellie lowered her gaze to the laptop in her lap. "Please don't make this worse for her." The sentence was quiet, but there was something in it almost unbearable. She was asking the most feared man in the city for gentleness as if it were not an impossible thing to request from him. Damien held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. She nodded once as if that would have to be enough. The car slowed before a worn brick building on a side street where the snow had been trampled to brown slush on the curb. Rust stained the fire escape. One window on the third floor had a towel wedged along the bottom seam against the draft. The entrance light buzzed, blinked, steadied. Ronan got out first and scanned the street on instinct. Damien followed the cold, hitting him clean and hard. Ellie stepped onto the sidewalk, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders, then looked up at the building with a face that had suddenly become that of a child again. Tired, hopeful, terrified. They climbed the narrow stairs. The hall smelled faintly of radiator heat, damp paint, and old cooking oil. Somewhere a television murmured behind a door. Somewhere else a baby cried and then was soothed. Ellie stopped outside apartment 4C. The blue paint around the frame had peeled back in strips. A thin line of warm light showed beneath the door. She looked once at Damien as if measuring whether the impossible was still standing there. Then she raised her hand and knocked. The door opened almost at once, as if whoever stood behind it had been waiting at the edge of panic for the sound. An older woman filled the doorway in a worn cardigan and house shoes, silver hair twisted up in a loose knot that had partly come undone. Her eyes were red from a night without sleep. Relief hit her face the second she saw Ellie, hot and immediate, and then just as quickly turned into anger, born from fear. Ellie Bennett. She pulled the girl inside with both hands and crushed her against her chest so tightly Ellie could barely breathe. Then she pushed her back by the shoulders and looked her over from head to toe with the fierce attention of someone counting limbs, counting bruises, counting breaths. "Where have you been all night? I called and called. I thought you were in a ditch somewhere. Your sister has been burning up with fever and asking for you every 10 minutes, and then I turn around, and your bed is empty." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ellie opened her mouth, but before she could answer, the older woman looked past her and saw Damien standing in the hall. Everything in her body changed. The relief was gone. The fear returned in a harder form. She shifted Ellie behind her without even seeming to realize she had done it. It was instinct old and immediate, the kind that did not ask whether the danger wore a gun or an expensive coat. "Who is he?" Grandma Ellie said quickly, still breathless from the grip she had just escaped. "It's okay. This is Mr. Vale." The woman's face went still. Even here, in a narrow hall that smelled of old plaster and radiator heat, the name landed with weight. Damien had watched powerful men tremble when they heard it. He had watched smaller men try to hide that they were trembling. On this woman, it did something else. It made her stand straighter, as if fear had to be met standing up, because there was nothing else left to use. "Why is he here?" she asked. Ellie looked over her shoulder at Damien, then back at her grandmother. "To help Claire." The older woman stared at her for one long second. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Then she stepped aside. The apartment was small enough that Damien could take in nearly all of it from the threshold. One main room served as living room, kitchen, and place to breathe. The floors were old, but scrubbed clean. A narrow sofa sat against the wall beneath a window, sealed at the edges with folded towels to keep out the draft. 2 chipped mugs rested upside down on a dish towel by the sink. A lamp in the corner gave off a tired yellow light. Nothing in the room was expensive. Nothing matched. Yet every object had been placed with care. The blankets on the sofa were folded. The dishes were stacked neatly. A carton of tea sat beside the stove with each bag lined up in its box as if order itself were a kind of dignity. Near the far wall stood a small artificial tree, no more than 3 feet tall, still without ornaments this early in the season, but a string of lights had already been wrapped around it in careful loops. Beside it lay a paper bag filled with colored scraps and a tube of glue. Ellie had made plans for it. For one strange second, that detail struck Damien harder than the poverty did. People at the edge of survival were still making room for a tree. Then came the sound from the back room, a cough, not light, not passing, deep and tearing, the kind that seemed to come from somewhere too far inside the body. Ellie was already moving before the sound finished. She crossed the apartment in 3 quick steps. Claire, the older woman, rose, pressed one hand flat to her chest, and closed the door behind Damien with the other. Ronan stayed just outside at Damien's quiet look. Armed men did not belong in rooms like this unless there was no other choice. The bedroom door opened. Claire Bennett stepped into the light. For a second, Damien thought Ellie had exaggerated nothing and hidden even more. Claire was 27, but illness had taken a brutal hand to her. Her face was too pale, her cheekbones sharpened by weight loss, the skin beneath her eyes shadowed in bruised half-moons that sleep would not fix. Her hair was tied back in a loose twist that had half fallen over one shoulder. She wore an old, long-sleeved shirt and soft gray pants, the kind of clothing chosen for comfort because there was no energy left for anything else. And yet there was still beauty there. Not the polished beauty of the women Damien had known in penthouses and hotel bars. Something quieter, more dangerous in its own way. The beauty of endurance, of someone nearly worn down and still refusing to bend where it counted. Her first look was for Ellie. Nothing else. She crossed the room with sudden speed, one hand to the wall for balance in the last step, and caught Ellie by both shoulders. "Where were you?" Her voice was rough from coughing, but the fear in it was unmistakable. She checked Ellie's face, her hair, the wet shoes, the borrowed blanket around her shoulders. Her hands moved with quick, practiced efficiency, looking for injury, looking for blood, looking for any sign that the night had done worse than frighten them all. Ellie reached for her. "Claire, I'm okay." "Do not ever do that again." The words came out low and tight, almost angry, but Claire's fingers would not stop trembling against Ellie's arms. Then she lifted her head and saw Damien, her whole body locked. The room seemed to narrow around that moment. Even the weak lamp in the corner felt sharper, somehow catching the hollow in her throat, the pulse beating there too fast. Claire knew exactly who he was. Damien could see it in the instant calculation that moved behind her eyes. Not confusion, recognition, not rumor, knowledge, rumor. The fear that crossed her face did not make her step back. It made her step in front of Ellie. The move was so immediate, so absolute, it happened before thought could catch up to it. One arm half spread behind her sister, her thin body set between Damien Vale and the only person in the room she would die to protect. Rose saw it. So did Damien. 3 women in one apartment, and every one of them placed their body between danger and someone they loved without hesitation. Claire's voice came out hoarse but steady. "What do you want?" Ellie tried to speak. Claire stopped her with a slight motion of her hand, never taking her eyes off Damien. "If this is about work, there is nothing left to take," Rose whispered Claire. Claire ignored her. Her eyes stayed fixed on Damien's face, reading him the way she might have read a ledger once, line by line, looking for what was hidden beneath the surface. Damien had met women who feared him, women who wanted things from him, women who smiled because smiling around powerful men had become a form of self-defense. Claire Bennett did none of those things. She looked ill enough to collapse, and still there was a challenge in the way she stood there. He answered plainly, "Your sister broke into my office." Ellie winced. Rose sucked in a breath. Claire did not blink. "She should not have had to," Damien said. "She came because Victor Hale has been stealing from me for years, and because when you found out he destroyed your life to bury it." Silence fell over the apartment. The kettle on the stove gave a small click as the metal warmed. Somewhere in the building, pipes knocked inside the walls. Rose's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Claire's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened. "You expect me to believe this is the first you've heard of it?" Damien looked at her for a moment. There were a dozen ways to answer that, most of them false. He chose none of them. "No," he said. "I expect you to believe I am standing in your apartment because your sister showed me enough proof that I could not ignore it." Claire's gaze flicked to Ellie, then back to him. "What proof?" Ellie took one step sideways, trying to see her sister's face. "Claire, I showed him the transfers, the emails, everything I could get from the copied files." A spasm of pain crossed Claire's face, small and quickly hidden, but Damien saw it. The effort of standing was costing her. Still, she remained where she was. Rose moved at last, perhaps because ordinary acts become a shield when everything else is impossible. "I am putting on tea," she said, voice unsteady but formal, as if formality itself might hold the room together. "People talk better with tea." No one told her not to. She lit the stove. The blue flame sprang up under the kettle and hissed softly. Claire gestured toward the small kitchen table with the caution of someone allowing a loaded weapon 1 inch closer for reasons she hated. "Sit then." Damien took the chair nearest the wall. It was old white laminate with a cracked vinyl seat. It wobbled slightly under his weight. Ellie sat beside Claire the instant her sister lowered herself into the chair next to her. Rose remained standing by the stove for a moment longer, watching all of them in the reflection of the dark window above the sink. Up close, Claire looked even more exhausted. There were fine stress lines at the corners of her mouth that should not have belonged to someone her age. Her hands were thin and elegant accountant's hands, but one wrist bore the faint purple mark of a recent needle stick from blood work or IV treatment. She tucked it under her sleeve the instant she noticed Damien looking. He kept his tone quiet. "Tell me your version." Claire let out a breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite contempt. "You mean the part where I was stupid enough to think if I reported fraud through proper channels, someone would care?" Ellie's fingers tightened around the blanket in her lap. Rose set teacups down with more force than necessary, the china clicking against the table. Claire looked at none of them. "When I started at Hale Advisory, I thought it was the first good thing that had happened to us in years. Benefits, a desk, clean work, a salary that meant I did not have to count grocery money in quarters anymore." Her eyes lifted to Damien's face. "For the first time since my parents died, I could plan 6 months ahead instead of 6 hours. Her voice was calm now, too calm. Damien knew that tone. People used it when they had told themselves the story too many times and emotion only got in the way of finishing it. "I noticed one vendor payment during a quarterly review. The amount was off pattern for the service listed. Then another. Same structure, different names. I checked filing records, registration dates, addresses. The companies looked real until you leaned on them. Then they folded." She paused to cough into her fist. The sound was brutal and dry. Ellie turned in her chair. "Claire, I'm fine." The lie was reflexive, automatic. Damien watched Ellie hear it and let it pass because challenging it would have started a different wound in front of strangers. Claire continued. "I documented everything quietly for 4 months. I did not know how big it was yet. I only knew someone was pulling money through a chain designed to survive a surface audit. And you took it to Hale, Damien said. I took it to internal review because that is what a sane person does when she still believes the system has a floor. The edge in her voice sharpened for the first time. By 3 that afternoon, I was in Human Resources with a printed file in front of me saying I had manipulated invoices and redirected client funds. There were signatures on pages I had never seen in my life. Security waited outside the door before I even sat down. Rose turned away at the stove and wiped quickly at her eyes with the back of one wrist. Claire looked at the tabletop. They would not let me clear my desk. They boxed my things and mailed them 2 weeks later. The family photo on my monitor came cracked. No one spoke. I tried to fight it. I used what savings we had on legal consultations and filing fees. Then my name started coming up in industry calls before I even submitted applications. People in finance are cowards when scandal is involved. Easier to believe the accusation and keep walking. The tea kettle began to whistle softly. Rose poured with trembling hands. A week later, Claire said 2 men found me after my shift. One mentioned Ellie's school. One mentioned my grandmother's church. She lifted her eyes again. That was when I understood I had never been dealing with bookkeeping. Damien heard the sentence and felt its exact truth. Numbers are only numbers until a man with power decides they are another way to hold a knife. Rose carried the cups to the table. Claire reached for hers with both hands, perhaps for warmth. Perhaps because one hand alone was not steady enough. Steam rose between them, fragrant and weak. For a moment nobody drank. Then Ellie spoke quietly. I found the hospital papers last week. Claire went still. It happened so fast only Damien and Rose seemed to notice. A freezing of the shoulders, a tiny lift of the chin. Defense settling into place. Ellie, you hid them under the electric bill folder. I did not want you reading private things. You mean you did not want me knowing you need surgery? Rose closed her eyes. Claire set the cup down with care that was almost painful to watch. Not now. Yes, now, Ellie said, and the child in her voice was suddenly gone. You keep saying not now like there will be time if we just act normal long enough. The apartment had become too quiet for breathing. Damien did not interrupt. Claire looked at her sister, and for 1 second, all the strength went out of her face, leaving only the truth underneath. She was tired. So tired. Tired in the bones, in the blood, in the part of a person that sits upright only because other people need them to. When she spoke again, the anger had drained away. I was trying to get us through Christmas first. Rose made a small sound that might have been grief or prayer. Ellie stared at her sister as if the sentence had cut deeper than any diagnosis. Damien looked from one to the other and felt a memory rise uninvited and vicious. His mother sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, mending his shirt under bad kitchen light, saying she was not hungry because she wanted him to eat the last egg. He had believed her because children need to believe the people keeping them alive. Claire Bennett had been telling those same lies in a different apartment in a different city for a different child. It struck him with sudden clarity that sacrifice always looked ordinary from inside the room where it happened. He reached inside his coat and took out the folded printouts Ellie had shown him in the office. These got me here, he said, but not far enough. Claire's eyes dropped to the papers. Wariness returned. There is more, Damien said, if you kept it. For a long moment, Claire did not move. Damien could almost see the calculations turning behind her eyes. Trust him, and lose the last weapon she had left. Refuse him and remain where she was sick and cornered with Victor Hale still standing. She rose slowly from the chair, one hand braced to the table as if the room tilted under her. Ellie half stood with her. Claire touched her shoulder lightly. It's all right. She crossed the small kitchen to the refrigerator. Then she knelt, winced at the effort, and slid her fingers under the edge of a loose floorboard hidden beneath the front foot of the appliance. Rose turned sharply. Claire. Claire pulled the board up anyway. Inside the narrow cavity lay a sealed plastic pouch no bigger than a hand. She held it for a second without opening it, looking down as though all the last months of fear had gathered into that one small shape. When she came back to the table, she did not sit. She placed the pouch in front of Damien. A cheap black flash drive rested inside. I copied everything the night before I filed the report, she said. Raw exports, transaction histories, emails, internal approvals, external registrations. I kept it because something felt wrong even before I knew how wrong. Her voice tightened. If you take that and it disappears, then I disappear with it. Damien looked up at her. He saw the fever and the faint flush high on her cheeks, the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, the absolute refusal to let either one make her small. He took the pouch and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. I understand. Claire held his gaze, waiting for the lie she expected to follow. None came. Instead, Damien said, "You are coming to the hospital today." Claire's laugh this time was real brief and bitter. "No." Rose whispered her name again. Ellie turned fully in her chair. Damien did not blink. "It is not a request." "Yes, it is," Claire said, "because you do not own me." Something faint moved in Ronan's silhouette through the frosted glass of the door, a shift of weight at the edge of the room. Inside, no one else moved at all. Claire straightened despite the effort it cost her. "I know what men like you call debts. I know what comes attached. I have spent 8 months trying not to owe the wrong person my life." Her eyes flashed with sudden heat. "I will not wake up in some private room and find out the bill has my name on one line and my obedience on the next." Damien looked at her for a long moment across the chipped table and the steam rising from untouched tea. Then he said very quietly, "I am not offering you pity." The words settled in the room between them hard and clean. "I am telling you my house crushed someone innocent while I was looking elsewhere," he said. "Victor Hale stole my money. That matters to me. He threatened a child and ruined you to hide it. That matters more." Claire stood motionless, one hand pressed lightly to the back of the chair to keep herself steady. Ellie's eyes moved from Damien to her sister, holding her breath, as if the answer might decide more than a hospital trip. Damien kept his voice low. "Call it repayment if charity offends you. Call it a business correction if that sits better in your mouth. But if you stay here and get worse because your pride is all that is left untouched, then Victor Hale gets to take one more thing from you." Claire looked at him, and something in her expression changed. Not surrender, not trust. Something more dangerous. She was considering him, really considering him. And in the silence that followed, the little apartment seemed to draw inward around the four of them, warm with tea and fear and the first thin edge of a choice none of them could walk away from unchanged. In the end, it was not Damien who made the choice for her. It was Ellie. She rose from her chair with the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders and stood in front of Claire, the way Claire had stood in front of her 100 times before. There were tears in her eyes now, but they did not fall. She had inherited that much from her sister, too. "Please," she said. Just that. Not a speech, not an argument. One word carrying the weight of every packed lunch, every late bill, every night Claire had worked until her feet gave out and still come home smiling so Ellie would not be scared. Claire looked at her, and whatever remained of the fight in her face softened into something far more painful. Rose set one trembling hand on the back of Claire's chair. "Go, sweetheart." For a moment, Claire kept her eyes on the tabletop, on the old scratches in the laminate, on the steam drifting up from tea no one had touched. Damien said nothing. He knew enough about pride to understand that speaking now would only make the choice harder. Claire lifted her face at last. "If I go," she said, voice rough and careful, "my grandmother and my sister go where I can find them. I do not wake up alone in a room full of strangers." "They go with you," Damien said, "and no papers get signed without my reading them." "Fine, and if any doctor talks to me like I am charity, I leave." One corner of Damien's mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the shadow of respect. "Then we find you a doctor who knows how to speak." Claire looked at him a second longer, searching for the trap. She did not find one she could prove. "All right," she said. The word was barely above a whisper, but the whole room changed around it. Rose covered her mouth with her fingertips and bowed her head for a moment, eyes closed. Ellie let out a breath she had probably been holding since dawn and pressed her forehead lightly to Claire's shoulder. Claire leaned into the contact for one brief second, then straightened as if embarrassed by how much of herself had nearly shown. Damien rose from the chair. "We leave now." The next hour passed with the strange speed that belongs only to crisis. Rose packed a small bag with a sweater reading glasses, medication bottles, and the rosary she kept near her bed. Ellie moved through the apartment, gathering Claire's essentials with a competence no 13-year-old should have needed to learn. A brush, a charger, a notebook, the folder of medical papers she had found in the drawer, the old coat Claire reached for out of habit even though it would not have kept anyone warm. When Claire swayed once near the bedroom door, Damien stepped forward without thinking. His hand closed around her elbow. She stiffened at once. He let go immediately. "I can walk," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the dignity in it had edges. "I see that," Damien said. She held his eyes a beat longer, then turned away and crossed the room on her own. By the time they made it downstairs, morning had widened across the street in weak winter light. The black sedan idled at the curb. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and half-open doorways, the way people in old buildings always watched trouble or money arriving, because both were rare enough to be memorable. Ronan opened the rear door. Rose climbed in first, then Ellie. Claire paused on the sidewalk, one hand on the roof of the car, breathing through what she clearly did not want anyone to notice as pain. Damien stood close enough to catch her if she fell, and far enough not to insult her by expecting it. She got in without help. The drive to the hospital took them north through a city that seemed determined to go on being ordinary despite the private storm inside the car. Commuters hurried through slush with paper cups in gloved hands. A school bus hissed at the curb. Delivery vans double-parked outside corner stores. The harbor lay gray and iron-flat beyond the rooftops. Boston in winter had a way of making every life seem a little more brittle. Claire leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closed, one hand flat over the folder in her lap. Ellie sat pressed to her side so tightly their shoulders did not separate even when the car turned. Rose whispered prayers under her breath, not loudly enough to intrude, just enough to keep fear from becoming silence. Damien made 2 calls on the way. The first was to Gideon Price. "I am on my way to St. Margaret's," he said. "You have 90 minutes to tell me how much of Victor Hale's personal life is held together by paper." He listened for a moment, then cut Gideon off when the lawyer began asking questions. "Do not use my name with anyone. Do not tip his accounts. Just dig." The second call was to a surgeon whose debt had been paid years ago and never fully forgotten. When he ended that one, Claire opened her eyes. "You move fast." It was the first thing she had said to him since leaving the apartment. Damien looked out the window. "Slow decisions are for people who can afford them." Claire studied his profile as if weighing whether that sentence had come from wisdom or damage. With Damien, the answer was usually both. St. Margaret's rose out of the back bay in clean glass and pale stone, too bright and expensive to look like a place where people suffered, though people suffered there all the same. Private entrance, private elevators, private silence. Everything designed so pain could happen discreetly. Rose hesitated in the lobby beneath the polished light fixtures and gleaming floors. Her house shoes had been traded for sensible boots in the rush, but she still looked as if the building might reject her on sight. Ellie looked upward with open caution, one hand locked around Claire's sleeve. Claire herself seemed to gather every thread of composure she had left and wrap it around her shoulders like armor. A woman in navy scrubs met them with a tablet in hand and the smooth professionalism of someone trained never to stare at money or power too directly. Ms. Bennett. Claire blinked as if hearing her own name spoken gently in a place like this was the first strange thing she could not file under danger. "This way." The room they brought her to was on the 12th floor and looked out toward the river, where the water moved under a pale wash of light. White sheets, warm air, clean glass, soft lamps instead of fluorescent glare. There was a sofa for Rose and Ellie, a private bathroom, a pitcher of water sweating onto a tray. Claire stood just inside the doorway, not moving. Then she crossed to the bed and touched the sheet with 2 fingers. It was such a small gesture Damien almost missed it. But there was something in the care of it that tightened unexpectedly in his chest, as if softness itself had become unfamiliar enough to require testing. Ellie moved to the window and looked out. "You can see the whole river." Rose did not sit. She set her bag down and looked around the room with a dazed suspicion that bordered on grief. Poor people know too well how quickly comfort can be withdrawn. The admitting physician arrived within minutes. Middle-aged, direct, no wasted charm. Damien liked her immediately for that. She introduced herself to Claire first, not to him. That mattered. She asked permission before touching her wrist, before listening to her lungs, before reading the scan reports from the folder. Claire answered every question with crisp precision despite exhaustion. Dates, symptoms, previous visits, medications. The physician listened without interruption and then explained the next steps in clear language. More imaging, blood work, pulmonary consult, Surgical review as quickly as possible. No false reassurance, no condescension. When the doctor left, Claire looked at Damien across the room. You chose well. He inclined his head once. An hour later, he was gone. Not because he wanted distance, but because if Victor Hale had been stealing through the structure of Vale Capital for years, there were too many open doors still standing. Damien left Ronan outside Claire's room with 2 of his own men on a rotating perimeter and went back to the tower with Winter still clinging to the hem of his coat. The conference room beneath Vale Tower had no windows and no natural light. Soundproof concrete walls, long black table, 8 leather chairs. It was the kind of room where decisions were made without witnesses and consequences left by separate doors. Ronan joined him after posting the hospital detail. Gideon Price arrived carrying a thin laptop and a thicker paper file. Nate Mercer came next, all restless fingers and sleepless eyes, the best cyber mind Damien kept within reach. Caleb Stone, who handled internal intelligence with the patience of a man who knew secrets always aged into leverage, took the seat nearest the wall. Victor's chair remained empty. Damien set Claire's flash drive in the center of the table. Open it. Nate plugged it in. Lines of data filled the screen, exported ledgers, archived mail chains, approval logs, layered routing paths. Claire had not copied scraps. She had copied a map. For the first 30 minutes, no one spoke except to identify a file or call up a record. Nate moved fast. Gideon cross-checked names against registrations and banking shells. Caleb compared internal routing patterns to suspected leaks over the last year. The room seemed to grow smaller as the shape of Victor Hale's betrayal spread across every screen. He had built 11 shell vendors under rotating service categories, used recycled tax identifiers from dissolved businesses, routed consulting fees through Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Delaware, and back into offshore accounts masked under family trusts. The money itself was ugly enough. The rest was worse. Caleb slid a folder toward Damien. 3 months ago, we flagged information slippage on the O'Donnell side. Shipping schedules that should have stayed inside our circle. Warehouse transfers. Port timing. I never found the source. Damien looked up. Caleb held his gaze. I think you just did. The room went completely still. The O'Donnells controlled enough of the South Shore and the docks to turn a bad leak into blood within days. Damien had spent years pushing them back from territory they believed was theirs by right and habit. To sell money was one thing. To sell doors inside the house was another. Gideon spoke next, voice low and careful. Victor has a house in Cohasset held under his wife's trust. 2 vehicles outside declared income. An account in Zurich tied to an educational non-profit with his son listed as beneficiary. Cayman exposure. 1 Singapore structure. I have not frozen anything yet, good Damien said. He stood pacing once to the far end of the room and back the old controlled motion of a man trying not to let rage choose its own direction. On the second pass, he stopped and braced both hands on the table. How much? Nate did not answer immediately. His fingers kept moving over the keys. Then he said 42 million confirmed so far. Maybe more once the Zurich and Singapore layers are pulled clean. Gideon exhaled quietly. Caleb looked down at the file in front of him as if numbers no longer interested him half as much as the shape of the treachery. Ronan was the only one whose expression did not change. He had known Damien too long to waste energy reacting before it was useful. Damien reached for the heavy water glass beside his hand and crushed it against the edge of the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Water ran over black wood and onto the floor. A shard bit into the heel of his palm. Blood slid through the spill in thin red lines. No one moved. Damien stared at the broken glass as if it belonged to someone else. 15 years, he said. His voice was soft. That was when every man in the room understood how dangerous the silence had become. 15 years he sat beside me, ate at my table, knew what my mother's name was. Damien lifted his gaze to the empty chair at the far end, and while I was trusting him with the bones of the house, he was selling the doors. Ronan set a folded handkerchief by Damien's wrist without a word. Damien ignored it. I want every personal account, every shell, every property, every educational transfer, every hidden insurance vehicle laid out so clean a federal judge could understand it at a glance, he said. Gideon nodded and began taking notes. Not one move until I say. He gets no warning. Caleb leaned forward slightly. And the O'Donnell trail. Map it, quietly. Nate closed one file and opened another, his face tightening as he tracked a sequence of false approvals. There's more in here than we would have found without her. He did not need to say Claire's name. It hung there anyway. Damien looked at the screen. Claire's work was everywhere now. Not dramatic, not careless, precise, patient. She had built the case the way some people built cathedrals, one exact line at a time while no one was looking. She kept this under her refrigerator, Caleb said, disbelief creeping through the words before he could stop it. Damien finally took Ronan's handkerchief and wrapped it around his cut palm. Because she understood the stakes before any of us did. At St. Margaret's, the day passed in scans and blood work and the slow humiliations of illness that hospitals turn into routine. Claire endured each procedure with a rigid calm that made the nurses gentler without her asking. Ellie remained in the room for everything she was allowed to stay for, and in the hallway for everything she was not. Rose prayed, dozed in short bursts, woke with apologies, then prayed again. By late afternoon, Claire was propped against a stack of pillows, looking more tired than before and trying not to show it. Ellie sat cross-legged on the sofa with the old laptop open, though she was not really using it. Her eyes kept lifting to her sister every few seconds on instinct. "You should eat something," Rose said. Claire looked at the tray and then away. "I'm not hungry." Ellie gave her a look that was so familiar and so much older than 13 that Claire almost smiled in spite of herself. "That line is getting weak," Ellie said. Rose made a small sound that might have been a laugh if worry had not been sitting on top of it. Claire shook her head. "You two are impossible." "Learned from the best," Ellie replied. For one moment the room felt almost normal. Then the door opened. 2 men stepped inside in dark winter coats, the kind hospital staff would not wear, and families from Claire's world could not afford. One stayed near the door. The other pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down as if visiting hours belonged to him. Claire's body went still in an instant. Rose gripped the arms of the sofa. Ellie looked from one face to the other, every nerve in her going alert. The seated man smiled with the polished restraint of someone who enjoyed appearing calm in rooms where he did not belong. "Ms. Bennett," he said. "Mr. Hale heard you were unwell." No one answered. He glanced around the room, taking in the private suite, the window, the monitors, the fresh flowers a nurse had left by the sink. Nice place. Somebody important must care. Claire found her voice before Rose or Ellie could speak. "Get out." The man did not move. He reached into his coat and laid a photograph on the blanket across Claire's legs. Ellie saw it first and sucked in a breath. It was her. Walking home from school in a knit cap and backpack halfway down a brick sidewalk in South Boston. Shot from inside a parked car, the edge of a dashboard visible in the lower corner. The man folded his hands loosely. "Cute kid." Rose made a strangled sound. Ellie went white. Claire did not touch the picture. Her hand stayed flat on the blanket as if any movement would crack something open that could not be resealed. "What does Victor want?" The man tilted his head. "For you to remember that staying quiet was the smart part. Hospitals make people feel safe. They shouldn't." He stood smoothing his coat. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Bennett. Recovery is fragile." The second man opened the door. They left with the same unhurried ease they had entered with. For 3 full seconds the room did not move. Then Rose lurched to her feet and crossed herself with shaking fingers. Ellie snatched the photograph off the bed and turned it face down as if the image itself could still hurt her. Claire reached for the phone by the bedside. Her hand shook only after she picked it up. Miles away, Damien was still in the underground room when his private line lit up with the hospital extension. He answered on the first ring. Claire's voice came through thin, strained and controlled by force. "He knows." Everything in Damien went still. "Victor sent men to my room," she said. They had a picture of Ellie walking home. The room around Damien disappeared. The screens, the table, the men seated at it. All of it dropped away under a single bright blade of focus. "When? Just now?" He looked at Ronan. Ronan was already on his feet. Damien spoke into the phone with deadly calm. "Stay where you are. Nobody leaves that room except with my people." He ended the call and turned to Ronan. "Move them." Ronan did not waste a second asking who, where. Beacon Hill, the brownstone on Myrtle. Full perimeter, separate cars, clean route. Ronan was halfway to the door before the order finished. Damien looked at Caleb. "I want the hospital cameras from the last hour. Every entrance, every elevator." At Nate, Pull Hales calls burner traffic anything that lights up near St. Margaret's. At Gideon, start the papers. Asset freezes sealed if possible. I want him waking into walls. They moved at once. Night came early over Boston. By the time Ronan reached St. Margaret's, the city lights were already smearing gold across wet streets. He entered Claire's room with 2 men behind him and all the quiet authority of someone who had never needed volume to be obeyed. Rose was packed before he spoke. Ellie had her backpack on and Claire's old coat folded over one arm. Claire herself sat upright in bed with the photograph in her hand, reading the threat over and over as if repetition might wring out the fear. Ronan stepped inside and shut the door. "Your sister stays here," he told Ellie. "You and your grandmother are coming with me." Ellie looked at Claire first. Always Claire first. Claire nodded, but the effort of calm had cost her. "Go with him. I'm not leaving you. You are if it keeps you safe." Ronan waited while the sisters argued with their eyes because whatever he was not stupid enough to rush that kind of love. At last, Ellie moved to the bed and bent over Claire, hugging her carefully around the shoulders. Claire pressed one kiss into her hair and closed her eyes for a second too long before letting go. Rose followed, touching Claire's cheek with one wrinkled hand. "I'll call the minute we get there." Ronan took the photo from Claire without comment and slid it into an inside pocket. Then he escorted Rose and Ellie out through a service corridor while 2 additional men took up position outside the room. Claire listened to the retreating footsteps until she could not hear them anymore. Only then did she allow her face to change, not into tears, into something harder. By morning she had not slept. When the nurse entered at 7 with fresh vitals and the clipped gentleness of a long shift nearly over, Claire was already sitting up against the pillows with the chart folder in her lap and the look of a woman who had made a decision alone in the dark. "I need a laptop," she said. The nurse blinked. "Ms. Bennett, you need rest." "I need a laptop." The nurse tried again, patient and careful. "The pulmonary team is coming up. Your surgery consult is this afternoon." Claire met her eyes. "Then they can consult while I work." The nurse hesitated. Claire picked up the room phone and dialed the private number Ronan had left before departing. Nate Mercer arrived 40 minutes later with a slim black laptop and a secure hotspot device in a hard case. He looked younger in daylight than he had in the conference room, more like a professor who had forgotten sleep than a man who kept criminal networks from being torn open. He set the equipment on Claire's tray table and paused when he saw the look in her face. "Mr. Vale said give you whatever you need," Good Claire said. "Because your people stopped too early." Nate almost smiled despite himself. "That's what he said you'd say." Within 10 minutes, she was inside the mirrored file sets from her flash drive and the expanded data Damien's team had extracted overnight. The room filled with the soft click of keys and the low mechanical hush of hospital air vents. Claire worked differently than Ellie. Ellie attacked systems like a spark hitting dry timber. Claire dismantled them like a watchmaker opening a clock patient enough to hear the hidden gears. She found the first miss in 20 minutes. "Your vendor chain branch is here," she told Nate, pointing at the screen. "You stopped at a New Hampshire consulting layer because the address is real. The address is real. The tax ID is not. It belongs to a dissolved marine parts company out of Gloucester from 6 years ago." Nate checked, then looked up sharply. "You're right." Claire did not react. She had already moved on. "And this account in Zurich, it is not standalone. It is shielded through an education nonprofit and then through a holding company in Hong Kong." Her fingers moved across the keys. "The board list is fake except for one name. Look at the treasurer." Nate leaned in. It was Victor's wife under her maiden name. He gave a low whistle he seemed to regret the second it escaped. From the 38th floor of Vale Tower, Damien watched the feed Nate had opened on a secure channel. Claire sat in her hospital bed with the IV still taped to the back of her hand, pale in morning light, the laptop reflected in her eyes. She did not look like a patient. She looked like a prosecutor assembling a case no one else had the discipline to finish. He joined the video without announcing himself. Claire noticed at once. Her gaze flicked to the corner of the screen where his face appeared and held there only briefly before returning to the data. "You missed another one," she said. Damien leaned closer. "Then show me." She did, and for the first time since he had stepped into apartment 4C, there was no fear in the way she spoke to him. No softness either, something far rarer. Equality. Earned in numbers. Earned in pressure. earned because both of them now understood that Victor Hale had made the same mistake so many dangerous men made. He had seen Claire Bennett as a woman he could erase. Instead, he had left a witness alive who knew exactly how to ruin him. By the time evening settled over the river, Victor Hale still believed he had room to maneuver. That was the privilege of men who had lied successfully for too long. They mistook delay for safety. They mistook the silence around them for ignorance instead of the careful closing of a fist. Victor spent the late afternoon in his office on the 21st floor of Hale Advisory, a glass corner suite trimmed in walnut and brushed brass, the kind of room designed to suggest discipline, refinement, legitimacy. Boston glowed beyond the windows in a wash of winter blue. Ferries moved like dark cuts through the harbor. The city looked orderly from that height, almost innocent. On his desk sat a crystal tumbler with 2 fingers of scotch untouched. Victor did not drink when he needed his head clear. The first sign that something had shifted was small enough another man might have missed it. A banker in the Caymans, who usually replied within minutes, took 2 hours. A private message from Zurich was shorter than usual. A second contact from Singapore asked a question he had no business asking. Victor sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. He understood Damien Vale well enough to know one thing. If Damien had discovered the theft, there would be no argument, no wounded speech, no invitation to explain. There would only be action, quiet and surgical. Doors closing, pathways narrowing, air disappearing 1 inch at a time. So he did what men like Victor always did when pressure found them. He went looking for the weak point. He pulled building access logs from Vale Tower through an old administrative channel he had never disclosed. There, buried among routine entries, was the anomaly from the night before. A service access door on the loading level opened just before midnight and showed no matching exit. He moved to hallway footage from the 38th floor. At 5:47 in the morning, Damien entered his office. 22 minutes later, Damien came back out. Ronan Shaw was behind him, and between them walked a girl in a coat too big for her shoulders. Victor froze the image and leaned closer. The picture was grainy, the angle poor, but he knew the set of that face, even blurred by distance and light. Ellie Bennett. For the first time in years, something cold and honest entered Victor Hale's chest. He sat very still after that. He did not swear. He did not throw anything. Men like Victor almost never did. Panic showed itself differently in them. In calculation, in speed, in the way the eyes sharpened because somewhere inside the animal had finally admitted the trap was real. He reached for his private phone and placed 3 calls in under 4 minutes. The first went to a courier who never asked names. The second went to a man who handled surveillance on uncomfortable matters. The third went to a second device no one in Damien's organization knew Victor still possessed. By 8:30 that night, Victor had men watching the private hospital wing where Claire Bennett had been admitted. By 9:10, he had confirmation Rose and Ellie were no longer at the apartment in South Boston. By 10, he understood enough to make one final move before the floor gave way. He sent a message to Damien. "Need to discuss an internal issue. Urgent." It was cautious, plausible, old in tone. The kind of message sent 100 times over 15 years. Damien replied 7 minutes later. "Pier Warehouse, 11:30. Victor read the words twice. His first instinct was suspicion. His second was memory. There had been countless meetings in old industrial spaces over the years. Sensitive ones, dangerous ones. Places where the walls did not talk and men did not ask who left first. He could still salvage this, he told himself. He still held knowledge Damien needed. Structures, routing lines, protected accounts. Enough hidden architecture to make even a powerful man pause before destroying him. The lie was not that he believed he could win. The lie was that he believed he could still bargain. The warehouse stood on the edge of the harbor where old freight buildings met black water and winter wind. The district had gone quiet by day in the years after container traffic shifted, but by night it still looked built for crime. Rusted beams, concrete stained by salt, heavy doors groaning against their tracks. A place where the city forgot to modernize and men with bad intentions remembered to return. Victor arrived alone. That, more than anything, showed how deeply habit had shaped him. 15 years at Damien's side had taught him how danger moved, but they had also taught him a more fatal thing. He still believed his history with Damien might count for something. Inside, one industrial light burned over a long wooden table. The rest of the warehouse was darkness. Damien sat at the far end in a black coat, his posture composed, one hand resting flat on the table. Ronan stood behind him, half inside the shadows, his face unreadable. On the table between them lay a precise arrangement of files. Victor knew what they were before he reached the chair. A chill moved under his skin despite the coat buttoned at his throat. He sat because standing felt too much like panic. For a moment no one spoke. The sound of the harbor came faintly through the walls, water knocking wood, wind moving through seams in the metal. Somewhere far off a buoy bell rang once. Damien's gaze rested on him with a stillness more terrible than fury. 42 million, Damien said. Victor opened his mouth. Damien lifted one finger. Do not insult me by pretending not to know which 42 million. Victor closed his mouth again. Damien slid the first file across the table with 2 fingers. Cayman statements, Singapore layering, Zurich educational shields, vendor chains, false tax IDs, insurance vehicles, internal approvals, a map of theft so complete it did not need a voice to accuse. Victor looked down and felt his own neat handwriting on years of signatures rise up like evidence from the grave. You built a cathedral out of small lies, Damien said. That part almost impresses me. Victor forced air into his lungs. If you found this, then you also found how much of your structure depends on me. Ronan's eyes flicked once toward Damien and back. Victor leaned forward very slightly, the old controlled charm edging back into his voice because it was the only shield he had left. You can be angry. You should be angry. But if you burn me, you burn half the scaffolding that keeps your clean side standing. Courts will ask questions. Banks will start digging. Rivals will smell weakness. He spread one hand over the files. You need me more than you want revenge. Damien regarded him for a long time. Then he asked almost conversationally, Did you think that when you threatened the girl? Victor's face did not quite change. It only emptied. That was enough. Ronan stepped forward and placed a single photograph in the center of the table. Ellie, walking home from school, head bowed against the cold, backpack on one shoulder, unaware of the lens. Victor looked at it, looked away, looked back again because he understood, before Damien said another word, that the money was no longer the center of the room. I never touched her, Victor said quietly. The excuse sounded pathetic even to him. Damien's expression did not move. No, he said. You were more efficient than that. You made sure someone else could do the touching later if necessary. Victor shifted tactics. The sister panicked. I only wanted her to keep quiet. The sister was lying in a hospital bed. She had already crossed a line. Damien rose, then slow enough to feel deliberate. Victor had seen Damien angry before. Most men had not lived long after seeing it. But what stood up from the chair now was worse than rage. It was judgment stripped of heat, cold enough to preserve every detail. He came around the table and stopped beside Victor, not touching him. When you stole from me, Damien said you made a decision. Victor stared straight ahead. When you sold information to the O'Donnells, you made another. Victor swallowed. When you framed Claire Bennett to protect yourself, you told me exactly what kind of man had been sitting at my table all these years. Damien bent slightly, voice lowering, until the words seemed to enter Victor's ear like ice. And when you sent men into her hospital room with a picture of her sister, you took away the last excuse you had. Victor looked up at him, then really looked, and whatever hope had remained finally began to leave his face. What have you done? Damien walked back to his seat and buttoned the front of his coat with calm, precise fingers. Your accounts are frozen. Victor said nothing. Your wife received copies of every transfer at 9:45. Victor's hand twitched once on the table. Your son's tuition trust was flagged and suspended before dinner. Color left Victor's face. The federal package went through Gideon 2 hours ago. Victor stared at him in disbelief. Not because he had not imagined prison. Men in their world always imagined prison for someone else. Because he had imagined something faster, darker, cleaner, a bullet, a river, a quiet disappearance. Damien had chosen something far worse. Public ruin. No, Victor said. It came out thin. Damien sat down again. You will not die in this warehouse tonight. Victor's breathing had become visible now, shallow and uneven in the cold. You will watch your name come apart in court filings and news clips, and your son's eyes when he learns who paid for his education. You will sit under fluorescent lights for years and understand very slowly what helplessness really is. Victor stood so abruptly the chair legs scraped the concrete. "You cannot do this without hurting yourself." Damien's gaze moved over him once almost lazily. "I already have." The sentence settled into the huge, empty warehouse with the weight of truth. Victor heard it too. Somewhere beneath all the theft and betrayal, Damien had taken the deepest wound personally, not because of the money or the rival leak, but because Claire and Ellie Bennett had forced him to look at the wreckage his empire could produce without his direct hand ever touching it. Victor seemed to recognize that a second too late. He reached for one last thing. "Who brought this to you?" he asked, though he already knew. Damien looked at the photograph in the center of the table. "A 13-year-old girl in frozen sneakers," he said. "She walked across Boston in the snow because she loved her sister more than you have ever loved a single soul on this earth." Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Ronan stepped to his side. No weapon, no threat, none was needed. For the first time in 15 years, Victor Hale understood what it felt like to be entirely at the mercy of another man's decision. Damien stood. "Take him to Gideon." Ronan's hand settled on Victor's shoulder, firm and final. Damien turned away before they reached the door. Outside, the harbor wind cut straight through wool and skin. He welcomed it. It reminded him he still had a body, still had blood moving through it, still had work left before dawn. Because while Victor Hale was beginning to lose everything, Claire Bennett was being wheeled into pre-op under hospital lights that flattened all human drama into procedure. At St. Margaret's, the morning came in muted silver through tall corridor windows. Nurses moved in soft shoes. Machines hummed. Monitors clicked and whispered in discrete rhythms. The city existed beyond the glass, but on the 12th floor, time had already narrowed to one thing. Claire was in a pale blue gown beneath warmed blankets on a rolling bed. Her hair had been braided loosely and tucked back from her face. Without color in her clothes and with the hospital bracelet around her wrist, she looked younger and more fragile than Damien had ever seen her. Yet even now there was nothing vague about her. Her eyes were clear, watching, measuring, holding steady for the people who needed steadiness from her. Ellie walked beside the gurney, one hand wrapped around Claire's fingers so tightly it seemed impossible they would separate at the doors. Rose followed on the other side, rosary wound through her knuckles, lips moving too fast for any one prayer to stay distinct. At the threshold to the surgical suite, a nurse touched Ellie's shoulder gently. "This is as far as family can go." Ellie did not let go immediately. Claire turned her head toward her sister and found a smile from somewhere. It was not large, it was not easy, it was enough. "Hold my coat for me," she said softly. "I want it when I come back." The old coat had been folded over the side rail. Ellie took it as if receiving something sacred. "I will." Claire looked at Rose next. "I'm all right." Rose's mouth trembled. "Of course you are, baby." People said such things in hospitals because language had no better tools for terror. The nurse asked again, kindly this time. Ellie released Claire's hand one finger at a time. The bed moved forward. Claire kept her eyes on Ellie until the doors closed between them. The waiting room at the end of the hall was too bright, too cold, too ordinary. Blue plastic chairs, a water dispenser humming in the corner, a television on mute showing the morning news to no one. On the far wall, a clock whose second hand sounded louder the longer anyone listened to it. Ellie sat with Claire's coat in her lap and pressed both palms flat over it as if heat might remain in the fabric if she held it hard enough. Rose sat beside her rosary, still working through her fingers, every third breath catching where she tried not to cry. Damien arrived 20 minutes after the surgery began. He had changed coats. There was a fresh cut on his right palm beneath the bandage. Otherwise, he looked exactly as he always did when he entered a room. Controlled, composed, dangerous. Only Rose and Ellie could tell the difference now. He removed his gloves, folded them, and took the empty chair beside Ellie without a word. She looked up at him. "You came." He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the operating room doors at the far end of the corridor. "I said I would. That was all." But it seemed to settle something in her. Ellie drew one shaky breath and looked down at the coat again. Hours moved badly in hospital waiting rooms. Not forward exactly. More like across rough ground. A nurse appeared once with coffee no one touched. A resident came through and did not stop. The television changed anchors. Snow began again outside the narrow side windows, fine and steady over the city. At 9:15, a surgeon came through the double doors in pale green scrubs and a paper cap mask hanging loose at his throat. Rose rose so quickly her chair nearly tipped. Ellie was on her feet before anyone could stop her. The surgeon's expression was composed but not easy. "There were complications," he said. "More tissue damage than we expected. We're still operating." Rose's hand flew to her mouth. Ellie did not speak at all. She only stood there, clutching Claire's coat to her chest, all the color draining from her face. The surgeon added details no one in the room truly heard. Another hour, possibly longer. They were doing everything they could. Then he was gone again. The doors closed. The room seemed to empty of air. Rose sank back into her chair with the rosary tangled between both hands now. Her lips moved faster, almost frantically. Damien remained standing a moment longer, eyes fixed on the doors, because there is a point beyond which even men like him do not know what to do with their hands. Then he sat. Ellie did not. She stood in the middle of the waiting room as if some invisible force held her there. Claire's coat gathered against her ribs, eyes wide and unfocused. A child trying to understand time through terror. At last her knees seemed to remember they belonged to her. She lowered herself into the chair and pressed the coat to her face. When she spoke, her voice came muffled through the fabric. "She's been tired since she was 14. Damien turned his head. Ellie kept looking down. "She never got to be scared." "Not really. When our parents died, she was the one who had to hold me. She had to hold Grandma. She had to work and cook and keep the lights on and pretend she knew what came next." The words began to shake as they came. "She has been tired for so long." The tears started then. Not dramatic, not noisy at first. Just a silent overflow she had held back through too many rooms and too many adult conversations that should never have belonged to her. Damien had no language for this, not the right kind. He had learned how to command, how to threaten, how to negotiate, how to cut a man in half with 10 quiet words. None of those skills entered a hospital waiting room usefully, so he did the only thing he could think to do. He placed his bandaged hand, careful and heavy, on Ellie's shoulder. She leaned against it without looking up. That small trust did more damage to him than any bullet ever had. He saw himself then in a county hospital hallway at 14, wearing shoes soaked through from rain, waiting for a doctor who kept not coming. He had sat alone because no one had been left to come sit with him. His mother had died while he still believed there might be time for the world to change its mind. He had built everything afterward, so he would never feel that helpless again. And still here he was, a man with enough money to buy buildings, enough force to clear neighborhoods, enough fear attached to his name to still conversations when he entered a room. And none of it meant a thing beyond the operating room doors. At 12:36, the surgeon returned. This time he was not running. That was the first sign. The second was in his face. Exhausted, yes, but the strain had lifted from around his eyes. He stopped in front of them and gave a small nod. She made it through. Rose let out a cry that turned into sobbing prayer before it finished leaving her mouth. Ellie folded into her grandmother so fast the chair legs screeched against the floor. She buried her face in Rose's shoulder and cried with the full, helpless relief of someone who had been bracing for the world to break and found at the last second that it had held. Damien stood and walked to the window at the end of the hall before anyone could look too closely at his face. Snow blurred the parking garage across the street. Tires carved fresh lines through white. An ambulance eased in under the awning. Ordinary life, brutal and indifferent, continued. He put one hand against the cold glass. The last time he had cried, he had been 14 years old and alone in a county hallway. He had thought that part of him froze solid that night. Now, with Ellie's sobs behind him and Rose thanking God in a broken whisper over and over, a single hot line of grief slipped down his cheek before he could stop it. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and kept looking out at the snow until his breathing was even again. Only when he turned back did he see that Ellie was watching him through wet lashes, still clinging to Claire's coat. She said nothing. Neither did he. Some things are less ruined when left unnamed. Hours later, when recovery finally allowed one visitor at a time, and Ellie had fallen asleep curled on the small sofa in Claire's room with the old coat wrapped around her like a blanket, Damien remained by the window in the dim light of afternoon. Machines beeped softly. Snowlight moved pale across the floor. Claire lay beneath clean hospital sheets, one hand outside the blanket IV line taped in place, face drawn and exhausted and alive. That last fact felt larger than the room. Her eyelids fluttered once then again. When she opened her eyes, they moved first to the sofa. She saw Ellie sleeping there, and something in her face eased at once. Then she turned slightly and saw Damien at the window. For a moment, neither spoke. Anesthetics still blurred the edges of her, but not enough to hide recognition. "You stayed," she whispered. Her voice was rough and thin from the tube, but the question inside it was clear. Damien came a little closer, though not close enough to crowd the bed. "Yes?" Claire looked at him with the slow, searching concentration of someone too tired for politeness. "You didn't have to." He could have answered a dozen ways. None would have been truer than the one that came. "When I was 14, my mother died in a hospital. Nobody stayed. The room went very quiet." Claire held his gaze. No pity entered her face. That was one of the reasons he could continue speaking. "I remember the hall more than the doctor. The smell. The vending machines. My shoes were soaked through. I thought if I left my chair she might die while I was gone." He looked once toward Ellie asleep with the coat in her arms, then back to Claire. "I did not want your sister waking into that kind of empty." Claire's eyes changed then. Not soft exactly, but open in a way they had not been before. "I'm sorry," she said. He almost laughed at the absurdity of her being the one to say it while lying there cut open and stitched back together because his world had failed her. But there was no absurdity in her tone, only recognition. Wound seeing wound. After a moment she asked, voice barely above breath, "Did you get him?" Damien looked at her for a long second. "Yes." Claire closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, more in release, as if some muscle inside her had finally been allowed to unclench. When she opened them again, she studied him with painful clarity. "You saved me," she said. He said nothing. She went on, still weak, still honest. "But men like you have ruined other people too." The words entered the room without accusation. That made them sharper. Damien felt them land. Claire looked at the bandage on his hand, then back to his face. "I know what was on your knuckles the morning Ellie met you," she said softly. "She told me in the car. Blood that wasn't yours." He did not deny it. "You came when no one else did," Claire said. "That matters." She drew a shallow breath. "But it doesn't erase everything." No one had spoken to him that way in years. Not because they did not know. Because they lacked either the courage or the standing. Claire had both, even half-conscious with pain. Damien looked at the sleeping girl on the sofa, at the old coat bunched under her cheek, at Rose's knitting bag tucked under the chair, at the warm lamp on the windowsill, small domestic things holding their ground inside a room his money had paid for and his choices had helped make necessary. "What does it make me?" he said at last, the question almost to himself. Claire watched him in the gathering dusk of the room, and because she was too tired to protect either of them from the truth, she answered with silence. The monitor beside her bed kept steady time. Beyond the glass, snow kept falling over Boston. And in the quiet that followed, for the first time in a very long time, Damien Vale stood inside his own life and found no clean answer waiting for him. For the next few days, St. Margaret's became the center of a world none of them had expected to share. Claire slept in fragments at first. Pain medication pulled her under, then let her rise again in short, fogged stretches where she would wake to Ellie bent over homework in the armchair, or Rose counting prayer beads by the window, or Damien standing near the door with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand because he had forgotten to drink it. He never stayed the whole day. Men like Damien did not vanish from their own empires for long without consequence. But he came in the mornings before the city fully woke, and in the evenings after the hardest decisions had already been made elsewhere. He entered quietly and left the same way, never asking for gratitude, never offering comfort wrapped in pretty phrases. He had learned perhaps too late in life that real suffering has no use for polished language. Claire noticed everything. She noticed that nurses straightened when he passed them in the hall, but he never spoke to them sharply. She noticed that he always asked the physicians direct questions and listened all the way to the end of the answer. She noticed that the first time Ellie fell asleep at the edge of Claire's bed with her math notebook still open. Damien crossed the room, lifted the book from under her cheek and slid a blanket over her shoulders with the care of a man handling something breakable and unfamiliar. He did not know Claire was watching that moment through half-closed eyes. She said nothing. Victor Hale disappeared from public view for 6 days. That in itself became a kind of event. At Hale advisory calls were redirected meetings, canceled, staff told their president had taken emergency leave for a family matter. People in finance were trained to ignore strange silences as long as the money still moved, but the money had stopped moving. By the end of the week, federal agents had entered the glass offices of Hale Advisory with sealed warrants and sober faces. Employees watched from cubicles while hard drives were removed, filing cabinets opened, records copied under fluorescent light. The local business channels began speaking in careful tones about irregularities, then fraud, then long-term financial misconduct. By evening, the language had sharpened further. Shell companies, offshore concealment, false reporting, witness intimidation. Claire saw the first news clip on the television mounted in the corner of her room. Victor stepped from a black sedan in a dark overcoat, one hand lifted against the cameras, his face colorless and strangely shrunken, without the smooth confidence he had worn for years. Behind him moved federal officers and attorneys. A courthouse door opened. The image cut to reporters speaking over each other into microphones. Rose crossed herself in the chair by the window. Ellie stared at the screen with a look too old for her age. Claire did not blink. She watched Victor vanish into the courthouse and felt something inside her, some knot wound so tightly for so many months, finally begin to loosen. Not because justice was clean. It never was. Not because the fear had disappeared. It had not. But because a man who had once controlled whether she ate, worked, slept, or looked over her shoulder had been dragged into daylight where paperwork and testimony could do what terror once had. Later that afternoon, Gideon Price arrived with a slim stack of documents and the grave satisfaction of a man who enjoyed precision more than victory. He stood at the foot of Claire's bed and explained each page before setting it down. The fabricated internal findings naming her as an embezzler had been withdrawn. Supporting records had been formally challenged and frozen. External notices damaging her employability were being corrected through court-ordered channels and private pressure. Within days, her name in every searchable system that mattered would be cleaner than it had been the day she walked into Hale Advisory. Claire listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached for the first page with careful fingers. Her hand still shook slightly from weakness, but not enough to hide from anyone watching. She read every line. That seemed to impress Gideon more than tears would have. Most people given back a piece of themselves stolen in public would have collapsed into gratitude or anger or both. Claire only read with full attention, as though even vindication deserved scrutiny. At the bottom of the last page, she stopped. "This paragraph," she said. Gideon leaned closer. "It implies the disciplinary action was based on procedural misunderstanding rather than deliberate fabrication." She looked up at him. "That wording protects people who knowingly participated." Gideon's eyebrows lifted. Rose smiled faintly from the window, not surprised in the least. Gideon took the papers back, read the section once, and nodded. "You are right." Claire met his eyes, then changed it. He held her gaze for a moment, and something like professional respect settled there. "I will." When he was gone, Ellie turned in the chair with a spark in her face Claire had not seen in months. "You scared a lawyer." Claire let out a soft breath that nearly became a laugh. "No, I annoyed a lawyer. There's a difference." That night, Damien arrived near 10 with the city still wet from melting snow. He found Claire awake, the news muted on the television, the corrected document draft resting on her lap. She looked tired, but stronger. Color had begun to return to her face in careful increments. It made her eyes look larger, warmer, less haunted. "You're smiling," Damien said. Claire looked down as if surprised to find it true. Only because Gideon writes like a man trying to apologize without actually saying the word. One corner of Damien's mouth shifted. "That is exactly how he writes." She handed him the revised page. He scanned the legal language once and understood at once what she had done. "You caught the shield clause." "I used to read contracts for people who counted on others not reading them closely." His gaze lifted from the paper to her face. "You catch everything." The room quieted around the statement. Claire held his eyes longer than she should have, and then looked away first. Not because she was shy, but because the air had changed in a way she was not ready to examine too closely. Recovery took time and refused to move in a straight line. Some days Claire sat up for hours and demanded coffee her doctor would not allow. Some days, fatigue settled over her so completely she could barely manage conversation without closing her eyes halfway through it. Yet each week she became a little more herself. The cough eased. Her appetite returned in cautious pieces. She took her first walk down the corridor, leaning on Ellie's arm and pretending not to see the irony when Ellie straightened with the importance of helping. Rose spent those weeks as she had spent most of her life, making herself useful wherever usefulness could soften fear. She folded blankets no one had asked her to fold. She memorized the names of nurses. She learned which vending machine ate dollar bills and which one did not. By the second week, half the staff on the floor knew her as the gentle grandmother who always thanked them twice. Ellie, once the first shock had passed, turned St. Margaret's into territory she could navigate. She found the warmest window in the family waiting lounge. She learned how to fix the old printer near the nurse's station when it jammed with discharge forms. She completed school assignments beside Claire's bed and read her articles about cybersecurity and data law when the afternoons grew too quiet. Damien watched her change too. The wild edge that had carried her across Boston in the snow was still there, but it no longer had to do all the work by itself. Safety had not made her soft. It had simply let her breathe enough to become 13 again in flashes. 3 weeks after the surgery, Claire was discharged. The new apartment waited in Beacon Hill, not the brownstone Damien had used as a temporary safe house, but a smaller place on a quiet street lined with old brick facades and black iron railings polished by rain. 3 bedrooms. A narrow balcony off the kitchen. Working heat. Hardwood floors scarred by generations of tenants. Light in the windows that felt more permanent than luck. Damien had offered to buy it outright. Claire had refused so quickly he almost smiled. "I will rent it," she told him while still sitting in the hospital bed. Her discharge papers spread across the blanket. "I will sign every page myself. I will pay what I can and owe what I can track. But I am not living in a gift wrapped like a favor." He had stood by the window and listened. "You think everything from me arrives with strings?" Claire adjusted the edge of the blanket over her legs, then looked up. "No," she said. "I think everything from powerful men arrives with history." There had been no point arguing with that, so the apartment was leased through Gideon's office under terms Claire could inspect line by line. She negotiated the clauses from her hospital bed while Ellie watched in admiration and Rose in faint disbelief. By the time the papers were signed, even Gideon had begun to sound as if he expected her corrections before she spoke them. Moving day felt almost unreal. Rose cried over the kitchen sink the first time sunlight came through the window, and laid itself across the counter where she had placed a bowl of lemons just because the room looked like one that should have something yellow in it. Ellie claimed the smallest bedroom and filled one shelf with cables, books, and broken electronics already waiting to become something else under her hands. Claire stood in the doorway of her own room, one hand on the frame, and looked around at walls that belonged to no memory of struggle yet. There are moments when relief hurts more than pain, because the body has forgotten how to hold it. Damien saw that in her face when he arrived later that evening, carrying nothing but a bottle of expensive olive oil Rose immediately declared too fancy to open on a weeknight. "This kitchen gets sunlight," Rose said for the 5th time, as if speaking the fact aloud kept it from being taken back. Ellie laughed and leaned against the balcony door. "Grandma, we heard you." "You will hear it 10 more times." Claire stood near the table in a soft sweater and dark pants, still thinner than she had once been, but no longer looking as if the next strong wind might carry her away. When Damien entered, her eyes lifted to him with a steadiness that had become different now. Less guarded. Not unguarded, never that. But no longer arranged purely around survival. She led him to the balcony after Rose insisted on putting soup on the stove, and Ellie vanished to untangle the new wireless router as if the entire internet depended on her immediate attention. Outside, the city had shifted toward early winter dusk. Rooftops darkening. Church bells from somewhere across the hill, the air cold enough to make each breath visible. Claire wrapped one arm around herself and looked down at the narrow street below. "I used to pass places like this and think people inside them must have done everything right." Damien rested one hand on the railing, and now she smiled faintly without looking at him. "Now I think they were probably just luckier at the right hour." He looked at her profile in the failing light. You are here because you kept going after most people would have stopped. Claire turned her head then. That sounds like something men say when they want suffering to sound noble. Damien's mouth moved with what might have been the beginning of a real smile. You don't let anything become sentimental, do you? Number. Good. The single word settled between them warmly. 2 months later, Claire entered a federal courtroom in a charcoal suit and low heels, hair pinned neatly back from her face, and gave testimony that turned a room full of attorneys into stillness. She did not dramatize. She did not tremble. She did not look at Victor Hale more than once, and even then only long enough to confirm he had become exactly what he most deserved to be, small. She walked the judge through the transaction paths as if leading someone through a building with every hidden stair already memorized. Dates, authorizations, false entities, account masks, insurance layers, international transfers hidden under educational cover, intimidation tactics, false disciplinary records. Each fact laid down with such methodical clarity that no one in the courtroom could mistake emotion for confusion or competence for luck. Victor listened from the defense table with the face of a man watching his own reflection testify against him. Afterward, reporters tried to approach her on the courthouse steps. Gideon moved first, then Damien's people, but Claire did not hurry. She answered one question only. How did you keep going after everything that happened to you? She looked past the cluster of microphones to where Ellie and Rose stood under the awning waiting for her. I had people to get home to, she said. That evening, the official correction to her record went live across every professional registry that mattered. The stain that had followed her for 8 months was gone. Not hidden. Removed. Job offers began arriving within days. Claire ignored most of them. Too vague, too flattering, too eager to borrow the shine of a public scandal while pretending not to notice where it came from. The one she did not ignore came from Damien. He asked her to meet him at Vale Tower, this time in daylight. The office looked different to Claire now. Still too polished, still too expensive, still built on histories she was not willing to romanticize. But the fear was no longer the same. She entered not as prey or supplicant or witness dragged upward by force. She entered as a woman who understood the numbers behind the walls better than many of the men working there. Damien stood by the windows overlooking the harbor when she came in. Boston flashed below them in winter light. Ferries cut white lines in dark water. The city looked like something sharp enough to survive. On the desk lay a single folder. He did not ask her to sit. Instead, he crossed the room and handed the folder to her directly. Claire opened it. The offer was concise. High-level financial oversight for the legitimate side of Vale Capital. Full compensation. Full authority over internal review protocols. Direct reporting access. Structural reform language written with suspicious care that told her Gideon had suffered over every paragraph. She read every page. When she reached the end, Damien was watching her with the stillness he reserved for decisions he actually cared about. You want me to audit your house? She said. Yes. Everything. Yes. She closed the folder but kept one finger between the pages. If I find something illegal, you report it to me. And if I think reporting it to you is not enough, his eyes did not leave hers. Then you decide what is. Silence stretched a moment. In the room beyond the glass wall, staff moved through corridors, unaware that the center of the building had narrowed to this exchange between two people standing 6 feet apart. Claire lifted her chin slightly. I will not become decoration for your conscience. Something dark and honest crossed Damien's face, gone almost before it formed. I know. And if I say no, then Gideon forwards your resume to 6 firms by noon and none of them know my name was ever attached to the call. She studied him. There was no pressure in the offer. No hidden leverage she could smell. Only risk, for both of them. I want independent review authority, she said. Quarterly minimum. Unrestricted file access. No internal barrier created above me. No protected books. Damien nodded once after each sentence. I report directly to you and only you. Yes. And if I tell you something is rotten, you do not ask me to look away. For the first time since she entered, he stepped closer. Not close enough to crowd her. Just close enough that his answer belonged to her and not the room. I asked for you because you don't look away. Claire held his gaze for a long second, then longer. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone quieter. All right. The word landed differently here than it had in the apartment weeks earlier. Then it had been surrender to help. Now it was consent to stand beside danger and name it properly. Ellie's future shifted almost as quickly. The acceptance letter arrived on a gray afternoon in early December. Thick cream envelope with the seal of a Youth Technology Institute in Cambridge embossed at the top. Rose nearly opened it herself in excitement. Ellie tore it carefully enough to preserve the envelope intact, unfolded the letter, and went still halfway down the page. Claire was the first to understand. She took the paper from her sister's shaking hand and read aloud the words Ellie could no longer get through. Full scholarship. Advanced placement in the Gifted Technology Program. Funding secured through the Margaret Vale Educational Foundation. Ellie looked at Damien as if he had somehow reached backward and repaired a promise before it finished breaking. "You named it after your mother," Claire said softly, still holding the letter. Damien looked at the floor for a brief moment. She deserved to have something in the world that helped instead of only hurt. Rose sat down abruptly at the kitchen table and began to cry. Not loudly, just the quiet, helpless tears of a woman who had run out of room for fear and found joy waiting there instead. Ellie crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and threw her arms around Claire first, because every victory in her life had learned that route by heart. Claire held her so tightly the scholarship letter crumpled between them. Then Ellie turned to Damien. She stopped in front of him, suddenly uncertain, then did what felt natural enough to risk. She hugged him too, awkwardly at first, briefly, the way children do when they still remember someone once frightened them but have chosen to believe better things anyway. Damien stiffened, then let one hand rest carefully between her shoulder blades. It was not grace exactly. It was learning. Christmas Eve came with light snow and the smell of butter and rosemary rising from Rose's kitchen from noon onward. The apartment glowed warm by 6. A real tree stood in the corner, now small but alive, its branches holding white lights and the odd arrangement of ornaments Rose had gathered from discount bins and church sales. Ellie had added a tiny silver circuit board to one branch because she insisted every tree needed at least one honest ornament. Claire moved more easily now, though she still tired by evening and had to sit when she thought no one noticed. Damien noticed. He also noticed that she laughed more. Not often, but enough to feel like witnessing weather change after a hard season. He arrived carrying a wrapped box and a bottle of wine Rose declared too expensive in exactly the same tone she had used for the olive oil. At dinner, they sat around a table just large enough to make elbows an issue and comfort a certainty. Turkey, potatoes, green beans with too much garlic because Rose believed that was impossible. Cranberry sauce. Ellie pretended not to like and ate twice anyway. Before anyone lifted a fork, Rose reached across the table and took Damien's hand. It happened so naturally he did not pull away in time even if he had wanted to. On Rose's other side, Ellie reached for Claire. Claire hesitated only a fraction before placing her free hand in Damien's. The contact was light at first, warm, human, her fingers slim and steady in his. Rose bowed her head and prayed over the meal in a voice made thin by age and thick with gratitude. Damien did not know the prayer. He did not close his eyes, but he stood inside the circle of hands and listened to a kind of peace he had never built for himself. Later, when dishes were stacked, and Rose was complaining that no one rinsed properly, and Ellie had already vanished into her room to begin setting up the laptop Damien had given her, Claire stepped out onto the balcony with a mug of tea cupped between both palms. Snow drifted over the rooftops in soft white currents. The city below looked briefly forgiven. Damien joined her after a minute, leaving the door cracked so the sounds of the apartment spilled lightly into the cold. Dishes. Rose's voice. Ellie laughing at something on the startup screen. Claire leaned her shoulder against the brick. "I still don't know what kind of man you are." There was no accusation in it now, only truth. Damien looked out at the falling snow. "Neither do I." She studied him for a moment. His profile in the winter light. The scar near his knuckle where broken glass had bitten him. The control so native to him it had become posture. Then she said, "But you came." That was all. He turned his head toward her. Snow gathered along the iron railing between them. Her hair had loosened in the damp air, one strand caught against her cheek. Without seeming to decide to, he lifted his hand and brushed it gently back. Claire did not move away. The city below them went on breathing. Somewhere a siren rose and faded. Somewhere, church bells marked the hour. Warm light spilled from the kitchen behind them and laid a soft gold edge along her face. Their hands found the same place on the railing. This time, when their fingers touched, neither one moved first. By spring, Victor Hale was sentenced. By summer, Claire had turned the Financial Oversight Division inside Vale Capital into something even senior executives approached carefully. Not because she was cruel, because she was exact. People who had once survived by hiding inside vague language now found themselves facing audit questions so precise they felt like confessions before they answered them. Damien never interfered. Sometimes he watched her through the glass wall of the conference room while she explained an internal inconsistency to men who had entered expecting to bully and left looking 10 years older. Sometimes Ellie came by after classes in Cambridge and spread hardware parts across Claire's office table until the two sisters bent over code and circuit boards together, laughing in a language of their own that had somehow made room for peace without forgetting hardship. Rose's balcony herbs took beautifully that first warm season. Basil, mint, rosemary. Small clay pots lined up in sunlight like evidence that life given a chance rarely stays small for long. One June afternoon, Damien stood in his office with the harbor lit gold beyond the glass. Ronan came in to remind him of a meeting downtown. Damien did not answer immediately. Across the partition in the smaller conference room, Claire had claimed for private review sessions. Ellie was showing her a prototype for a non-profit data protection tool she wanted to build for shelters and legal aid clinics. Claire was pretending to disagree with some structural choice only so Ellie would defend it more clearly. Rose sat by the window with a paperback open on her lap, not reading a single line because she was too busy watching them both with quiet contentment. Ronan followed Damien's gaze and said nothing. At length, Damien spoke, still looking through the glass. She walked into my office in wet shoes and rewired my whole life. Ronan allowed the smallest trace of a smile. Kid had nerve. Damien looked down at the city spread beneath them, then back to the room beyond the glass where Claire laughed at something Ellie had said and tucked a strand of hair behind one ear in a gesture he had come to know too well. He did not call it redemption. He did not call it love, though perhaps by then it had already become some quiet form of both. He only stood there in the summer light with his empire behind him and those three women, impossible and unafraid, at the center of the future he had not known how to imagine before they arrived.